The rain came in off the harbor like it had a grudge, driving sideways down Oak Street and turning the gutters into small rivers that carried cigarette butts and fast food wrappers toward the storm drains. Jason Robinson stood behind the bar at the Iron Anchor and watched it through the window the way a man watches something he has no power over, with patience and without complaint. The bar sat at the edge of Ravenport's dock district, wedged between a fish market that had been closed for 3 years and a pawn shop with a hand-lettered sign in the window that read, "Going out of business sale." A sign that had been there since before Jason started working the Thursday night shift 5 years ago. The building smelled like stale beer and old wood, and something underneath both of those things, something older. Like the memory of when this part of Ravenport had actually meant something. The neon sign outside was missing the H in Anchor. Nobody had fixed it. Nobody was going to. Jason had the place to himself. Thursday nights were like that, quiet enough that the owner didn't bother sending two people in, which suited Jason fine because quiet meant he could study. His criminal procedure textbook sat open on the flat section of the bar between the register and the speed rack, the spine cracked from use margin notes crawling up every page in his small pressed handwriting. 6 days until the final. He'd been running on 4 hours of sleep for 2 weeks and had stopped noticing the exhaustion the way you stop noticing a low hum after it's been going long enough. He was wiping down a rocks glass that would never be fully clean, the kind of glass that had been through 10,000 cycles of bar soap and hot water, and still held on to something when the door opened. Have you ever had someone look straight through everything you built, the titles, the money, the armor, and just see you? This is a story about what happens when that cuts both ways. She stood in the doorway for a moment, rain dripping from a coat that cost more than 6 months of Jason's rent. Dark hair perfect despite the storm, the kind of hair that suggested either extraordinary genetics or a very expensive stylist. And with women who wore coats like that, it was usually both. She looked around the empty room with an expression of careful neutrality, the specific face that people with real money learn to make when they find themselves somewhere they didn't expect to be and don't want to show it. Jason didn't look up from the glass. "We're open." Her heels clicked across the worn floorboards. Up close, she was younger than he'd initially registered, early 30s maybe, with dark eyes that moved across the room the way a person's eyes move when they're assessing something, cataloging it, measuring it against some internal scale. She sat down on one of the bar stools, and the way she settled into it told him she wasn't a regular bar person. Too deliberate, too upright. "What do you recommend?" The voice was even controlled, the kind of voice that had given a lot of presentations in a lot of rooms where the stakes were high. "Depends on what you're looking for." "Surprise me." Jason almost said something about people who asked to be surprised, usually having very specific ideas about what kind of surprise they wanted, but he reached for the whiskey instead. Not the cheap stuff, and not the bottle they kept on the top shelf for special occasions. The mid-shelf Knob Creek that tasted better than it had any right to at that price point. 2 fingers into a clean glass. He set it down in front of her, and then, without thinking about it much, set a glass of water beside it. She looked at the water glass, then at him. "You look like you could use it more than the whiskey." One dark eyebrow lifted slightly. "Most people who come in during a storm," Jason said, picking up the towel again and working the bar between them, giving his hands something to do, "are either running from something or running to something. Either way, hydration helps." A pause, then, "Which one are you?" "I'm just working." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got." She picked up the whiskey glass and studied the amber liquid with the focused attention of someone who approached even minor decisions seriously. Then she took a sip. Something shifted in her expression, surprise, genuine and unguarded, before she controlled it back down. "This is good. Don't sound so shocked." "I didn't mean—" She stopped. Then unexpectedly, she laughed. Not the polished, practiced laugh of someone performing warmth, something real shorter that seemed to catch her off guard as much as it caught him. "Okay, I did mean it that way. I'm sorry. That was rude. You're not the first person to walk in here expecting the worst, but you still gave me the good stuff." Jason set the towel down and looked at her directly for the first time. "You asked me to surprise you." She turned the glass in slow circles on the bar. "I'm Nicole." "Jason. Do you work alone on Thursday nights, Jason?" "Owner figures one person can handle the crowd." He gestured at the empty room. Not exactly a gamble. Nicole glanced around the peeling paint above the jukebox that hadn't worked in 3 years. The neon beer signs that buzzed and flickered, the water stain on the ceiling that had been there so long it had its own particular shape, like a rough map of a country that didn't exist. Then she looked back at him. How long have you worked here? 5 years, give or take. You like it. It pays the bills. That's not what I asked. Jason stopped moving. He studied her the way she'd been studying everything else in the room, carefully trying to figure out what it meant. People asked questions like that when they were making conversation, filling silence because they were uncomfortable with it. But something in the way Nicole was watching him suggested she actually wanted the answer, and that was different enough to be interesting. No, he said finally. I don't particularly like it, but it's flexible and I need flexible. Why? Because I'm in law school and I have a kid, and I don't have the luxury of only doing things I like. The words came out more direct than he'd intended, with an edge he hadn't planned on. He waited for the reaction, the slight backward lean, the recalibration, the polite redirect that people used when a conversation had gotten more personal than they'd bargained for. Nicole didn't lean back. She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the bar. How old? 7. His name's Thomas. That's young to be raising a kid alone. He was younger when I started. She took another sip of the whiskey. Her eyes hadn't left his face. Law school and single parenting. That's ambitious. That's life. Most people would say that's too much. Jason reached under the bar and pulled out his textbook, setting it on the counter, not hiding it, not making a statement with it, just being honest about what his night actually looked like. Most people aren't in my situation. But Nicole didn't take the signal. Instead, what kind of law? On our criminal prosecution. So you want to put people in prison. I want to hold people accountable when they hurt others. There's a difference. Is there? He met her gaze, trying to read whether she was genuinely curious or doing the things some people did, poking at other people's beliefs the way you test furniture before deciding whether to buy it. Yeah, because accountability isn't just about punishment. It's about victims seeing that what happened to them mattered, that someone cared enough to stand up and say this was wrong. Nicole was quiet for a moment. She turned her glass in slow circles on the bar. That's idealistic. Maybe. You don't think the system's broken. I think it's full of cracks. Doesn't mean it's not worth trying to fix from the inside. Something moved across her face. Then not the condescending smile he'd half expected, but something that looked unexpectedly like respect. Fair enough. The rain picked up outside, harder against the windows. Jason glanced at the clock. 9:47, 2 more hours until close, and Nicole Torres appeared to be his only customer for the night. He found himself less bothered by this than he would have predicted 20 minutes ago. What about you? He picked up the towel again. What do you do? I run a company. What kind of company? The kind that makes a lot of money. He waited. She didn't add anything. That's impressively vague. I'm impressively private. And why are you sitting in a dive bar in the middle of a storm having a conversation with a stranger? The polished surface of her expression shifted, and underneath it, just for a moment, he saw something raw. Not vulnerability exactly, but the thing that lives next to vulnerability, the thing you feel when you're tired of performing. Because sometimes strangers are easier. But what nobody at Nicole's company knew, what nobody in her carefully managed life knew, was that she hadn't had a single real conversation in 4 years. Not one that wasn't about leverage returns or quarterly projections. She was 30 years old and she genuinely did not know what she wanted. She had optimized every system in her life except the one that mattered. Jason reached for a glass and poured himself a small measure of the Knob Creek, breaking his own rule about drinking on shift. It was a slow night, and something about this woman made him feel like the normal rules didn't quite apply. He lifted the glass toward her, and she tapped hers against it. They drank in silence for a moment. Outside, water hammered the windows. The jukebox sat dark and dead in the corner. The neon signs buzzed their uneven rhythm, and Jason Robinson, who had not had a conversation that felt like an actual conversation in longer than he could precisely remember, found himself in no hurry for Nicole Torres to finish her drink and leave. You said Thomas, Nicole said after a while. Does he know what you're trying to do? The law school thing. He's 7. He knows I go to class sometimes and that I study a lot. He doesn't really understand why yet. What will you tell him when he's old enough to ask? Jason thought about his son's face when he laughed the full body thing, the way it took over his whole small frame. He thought about Thomas conducting a very serious legal proceeding last Saturday involving 2 plastic dinosaurs and a jury of stuffed animals. That I wanted to build something better for him, that I wanted him to see that you don't have to accept the hand you're dealt. Is that what you're doing, not accepting the hand you were dealt? He thought about his ex-wife leaving when Thomas was 6 months old packing, while he was at work leaving the signed custody papers on the kitchen counter, not even a note beyond the legal document. He thought about his mother's diagnosis 18 months ago about moving Linda in when she couldn't afford her own place anymore, about the particular mathematics of his life, which never quite added up to enough, but somehow always added up to enough to keep going. I'm doing what I have to do, he said quietly. Nicole nodded slowly like she understood something he hadn't quite said out loud. That's harder than it sounds. Yeah, it is. They sat in the near-empty bar with the rain working the windows, and something between them that wasn't quite ease. It was too new for ease, but wasn't discomfort either. It was the particular atmosphere of 2 people being more honest with each other than they'd planned to be. Can I ask you something? Nicole said after a while. Sure. When's the last time you did something purely because you wanted to, not because it was practical or necessary or good for Thomas? Just because it made you happy. Jason opened his mouth, then closed it. He turned the question over, looking for the answer the way you look for something in a room you know well, methodically sure you'll find it. But he couldn't. He genuinely could not recall the last time he had done something for no reason other than that he wanted to. Nicole watched him not find the answer. That's what I thought. What about you? The question came out sharper than he intended defense dressed as counterattack. When's the last time you did something that wasn't about business or money or whatever empire you're running? Her smile was the sad kind, the kind that knows it's sad and can't help it. I can't remember either. Then we're both pretty pathetic. Or we're both just really good at surviving. Jason laughed despite himself, a real one, sudden and unplanned. That's a generous way to put it. I'm a generous person. Are you? She considered the question, seriously turning her glass. I don't know anymore. I used to think I was. But somewhere along the way I started measuring everything by what it cost and what it returned. People, relationships, time. It all became transactional. That sounds lonely. It is. She looked up at him, and in her eyes was something that didn't match the coat or the posture or the careful voice. Something that had been sitting in the dark for a while. Is that why you're alone, because you can't afford the transaction? The question landed differently than he expected, not intrusive but precise, like it had found the exact spot. He gripped the edge of the bar, feeling the worn wood under his palms, wood that had absorbed years of elbows and spilled drinks and the particular weight of people's trouble. I'm alone because I don't have the energy to pretend I'm someone I'm not, and most people want the pretense more than they want the reality. What's the reality? That I'm 32, working a bar, barely making it through law school, raising a kid by myself, and taking care of my sick mother. I don't have time for anything beyond survival. Most nights I barely have time to sleep. But you want those things. Her voice was quiet now. The other things, beyond survival. He didn't answer. The honest answer was yes. The practical answer was that it didn't matter what he wanted. Nicole set her glass down with a soft click. What if someone didn't need you to pretend? Then they'd be lying. Everyone needs something. What if I just needed someone to talk to? No pretense. No expectations. He studied her carefully, looking for the angle to play. Whatever this actually was. Women who arrived in coats like that didn't wander into bars like the Iron Anchor, looking for honest conversation with bartenders who studied for law exams between customers. There was always an angle. He'd been alive long enough to know that. I'd say that sounds too good to be true. Maybe it is. She stood reaching for her coat. Or maybe we're both so used to things being complicated that we don't recognize simple when we see it. She pulled out a slim black wallet and set $200 bills on the bar. That's too much. Consider it payment for the honesty. I'm not a therapist. No. She looked at him steadily. You're better. You're honest. She buttoned her coat and turned toward the door, then paused with her hand near the frame. I come to Ravenport on business sometimes. Would it be okay if I stopped by again? Every practical instinct Jason Robinson had built over 7 years of not having the luxury of impractical instincts told him to say no. This was complicated. This was trouble of a particular kind, not dangerous, but the kind that cost you things you couldn't necessarily afford to lose. His mouth said, sure, if you want. Nicole smiled, really smiled, the kind that wasn't performing anything. Then she walked out into the rain and the darkness, heels clicking on the wet sidewalk until the sound was swallowed by the storm. Jason stood behind the bar and looked at the $200 bills and the empty glass she'd left behind. He should have said no. He knew that. But something about the way she'd looked at him, not at what he did, not at where he was, but at him, had short-circuited the defense mechanisms he'd spent years building into something reliable. He picked up her glass and washed it, watching the water run clear. The rain showed no signs of stopping. Outside Ravenport's dock district sat wet and empty under the broken sign, and Jason Robinson, who had stopped allowing himself to want things he couldn't keep, was already thinking about the next Thursday. The next 3 days ran in their usual pattern, which was to say they ran hard and left no margin. Jason worked his Friday and Saturday shifts at the Iron Anchor, spent Sunday morning on his criminal procedure paper, while Thomas conducted an elaborate paleontological excavation in the living room, using couch cushions as dig sites and his grandmother's cooking utensils as tools. He sat through his Monday classes on 4 hours of sleep and a thermos of bad coffee, got through Tuesday's evidence lecture by sheer accumulated stubbornness, and told himself 17 times across the course of those 3 days that he was not thinking about Nicole Torres. He was thinking about Nicole Torres. She came back on Monday night when the bar was noisier than usual, some kind of informal darts gathering that brought in a cluster of regulars and their friends. She wasn't dressed the same. That night she wore dark jeans and a simple black sweater, her hair down around her shoulders, and she looked younger somehow, less armored. She waited patiently through the rush, which surprised him. He'd half expected her to leave when she saw the crowd. Instead, she sat at the same stool she'd taken on Thursday and sipped her whiskey and watched him work with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who had nowhere better to be. How did the exam go? She asked when the last of the darts crowd had cleared out around 10:30, and Jason had finally had a chance to breathe. He blinked. It took him a genuine moment to register that she'd remembered not just that there had been an exam, but that it mattered that the outcome was something worth asking about. It went okay. Won't know until grades post. When do you graduate? If everything goes to plan next May. And then, bar exam. Then I look for a prosecutor position. Then I start figuring out how to pay off the debt I've been accumulating to get there. Nicole was quiet for a moment, studying him with that same focused quality he'd noticed on Thursday. Not the assessing look she'd come in with, but something different. Something that seemed genuinely interested in the answer, not in what the answer revealed about his usefulness. Do you ever resent it? She asked. All of this. Some days more than others. But you don't quit. Can't afford to. That's not the same thing as not wanting to. He met her eyes. Something passed between them in that exchange recognition. Maybe the particular acknowledgement of two people who have both spent significant time pretending something isn't true. No, he said. It's not the same thing. And I don't want to quit, even on the bad days. Because every time I think about stopping, I think about Thomas asking me why. And I don't have a good answer for that. Nicole turned her glass on the bar. Your son's lucky to have you. He'd probably disagree. I'm not around as much as I should be. You're around as much as you can be. That's different. Is it? Yes. She said it with a certainty that caught him off guard. My father was present in body constantly when I was growing up, and absent in every way that counted. He taught me that being there and actually showing up are two completely different things. She paused, something tightening briefly around her eyes. He built the company I now run. When he died 5 years ago, everyone expected me to sell it and live on the proceeds. Instead, I gutted the entire operation and rebuilt it from scratch. Why? Because I needed to prove I could do it better, that I wasn't just his name on a door. Her smile was sharp, private. I tripled the revenue in 3 years and expanded into 6 new markets. Jason raised his beer in a small, genuine salute. That's not just impressive. That's a statement. It should be. I gave up everything else for it. He waited. I regret that I'm 30 years old and I can count the real conversations I've had in the last 5 years on one hand. I built something massive and successful and completely hollow. Her voice was even controlled, but he could hear what lived under the control, something exhausted. I'm so good at winning that I forgot what I was supposed to be winning for. He knew that feeling. Not from the same direction. He'd never had the money or the empire, but he knew the particular emptiness of accomplishment that has nobody standing next to it. Why don't you change it? Because I don't know how. I've optimized every part of my life for efficiency and output. I don't know how to optimize for the other things. Maybe you're not supposed to optimize it. Maybe you're just supposed to let it happen. Nicole looked at him with an expression that suggested he'd said something that landed differently than he intended. Not profound, just unexpected. Like finding a window in a wall you thought was solid. Is that what you do? Are you kidding? I optimize everything. I have to. There's no room for anything else. He paused. But I know what Thomas's laugh sounds like. And I know what it feels like when I get through an exam and think maybe I knew enough. And I know that sometimes when I'm closing up at 2 in the morning, I feel something that might be pride just for making it through another day without breaking. That's a low bar for happiness. Maybe, but it's my bar. She smiled at the unintentional double meaning. And Jason felt something warm and inconvenient spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the beer and everything to do with the way she was looking at him, like he was a person worth looking at. Would you have dinner with me? She asked. He went still. Dinner, food, conversation. Somewhere that isn't this. She glanced around the bar without malice. Not that this isn't fine. Are you asking me on a date? I'm asking if you'd like to spend more than scattered hours in a bar with me. What we call it is up to you. Every rational part of Jason's mind ran the numbers. Nicole Torres, who wore $4,000 coats and ran real estate empires, was sitting in a dock district bar asking a bartender/law student to dinner. The numbers didn't work. There was an angle he wasn't seeing because there was always an angle. But another part of him, the part that had been alone for 7 years and had learned to call the loneliness practicality, wanted desperately to say yes. I can't. The words came out quiet. It's not that I don't want to, but I have Thomas. Anything I start with someone, he gets attached. If it doesn't work out, he's the one who pays. So you just don't date at all? Pretty much. That seems like a lonely way to live. It is, but it's safer than the alternative. Nicole set her glass down, and for a moment he thought she was going to leave. And something in his chest panicked at the thought in a way he hadn't experienced in years. But instead, she leaned forward across the bar, just close enough that he caught the edge of her perfume, something understated expensive that made it hard to think clearly. What if I promised that when it ends, and I understand the statistics suggest it might, I'd be honest with Thomas about it, that I wouldn't disappear, that I'd make sure he understood it wasn't his fault? Jason stared at her. Why would you promise that? Because I think you're worth taking seriously, and because I think I might be worth it too if you gave me the chance to show it. You don't even know me. I know you're honest. I know you're loyal to the people you love to the point of running yourself into the ground. And I know that when you look at me, you see a person, not a title or a checkbook or a complication to manage. Her voice dropped just slightly. That's more than most people see. He gripped the edge of the bar. His hands were unsteady in a way they almost never were, because he'd trained steadiness into himself the way you train a reflex through repetition and necessity. I can't promise anything. I barely have time to sleep. Then don't promise anything. Just have breakfast with me once. If it's terrible, we'll call it an interesting mistake and move on. And if it's not terrible, we'll figure it out as we go. He looked at her for a long time. He looked at the exhaustion she was carrying, the loneliness she'd admitted to the way she'd stayed, and waited through the noise of the darts crowd for the chance to sit at this bar and talk to him like he was real. And he realized something saying no wouldn't protect Thomas. It would just protect Jason from the risk of wanting something he might not be able to keep, and that was different. One breakfast, he said. Nicole's smile was the kind that changes a room. One breakfast, but I pick a few options and you have final say. That's not how final say works. That's exactly how Final Say works when one of us knows the city better. She wrote her number on a cocktail napkin, actual pen, actual paper, not a digital exchange, and pressed it into his hand. Her fingers were warm against his palm. Sunday morning. Sunday morning. He looked at the napkin. What's your preference for location? I'll text you 3 options tonight. You pick. He texted her back at 11:45 after closing. How about Maggie's on fifth best pancakes in the city, and they don't require a second mortgage? Her reply came immediately. Perfect. 10 a.m. See you there. Jason locked up the bar, walked to his car, and sat in the driver's seat for a full minute before starting the engine. He told himself this was almost certainly a mistake. He had a paper due Monday and a parent-teacher conference Tuesday, and his mother had a follow-up appointment Wednesday that couldn't be moved. Adding this, whatever this was, into the architecture of his life seemed like the kind of decision that preceded collapse. But the napkin was in his jacket pocket, and he was not going to pretend he wasn't counting the hours. The week moved at the pace weeks always move when you're waiting for something at the end of them, simultaneously too slow and too fast, full of moments that seemed designed to remind him how little room his life had for anything new. Wednesday night, he came home from his shift to find his mother, Linda, at the kitchen table surrounded by prescription bottles and medical bills, her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. Her handwriting slowed by the tremor in her right hand that had been getting worse for 6 months. Mom, you should be in bed. She didn't look up from the paperwork. Couldn't sleep. Did you know they charged us $300 for a consultation that lasted 8 minutes? I'll call them tomorrow. You said that last week. And I'll say it again next week if I have to. That's how persistence works. He moved behind her chair and started massaging her shoulders, feeling the knots of tension his hands had memorized over the last year and a half. You're not supposed to be stressing about this. That's my job. Linda reached up and patted his hand, the gesture familiar and specific to her, a thing she'd done since he was young. You have enough jobs. One more won't kill me. That's what worries me. She turned in her chair and studied him with the particular attention of a mother who has been reading her son's face longer than he's been able to hide things from her. When's the last time you did something for yourself? He thought about Nicole asking him almost the same thing 5 days ago from the other side of a bar. I'm fine. I didn't ask if you were fine. Thomas appeared in the hallway doorway in his pajamas, clutching the triceratops he'd been inseparable from for 2 years. He'd heard something, or he'd had one of the dreams he never fully described. Dad, are you home? I'm home, buddy. Jason left his mother's shoulders and crossed the room, crouching down. What are you doing up? I heard you. Thomas considered this adequate explanation. Is Nana okay? Nana's fine, just some paperwork. He picked Thomas up and carried him back toward his room, the small body warm and heavy with the particular density of sleepy children. Back to bed. Will you stay until I'm asleep? Yeah, I'll stay. He sat on the edge of Thomas's bed until his son's breathing evened out and the grip on the triceratops went loose, and then he sat there a while longer in the dark, listening to his mother moving slowly through the apartment, listening to the sounds of the building settling around him, thinking about the napkin in his jacket pocket and what it meant that he hadn't thrown it away. Sunday arrived with the kind of mild October weather that Ravenport produced occasionally, as if apologizing for the previous week's rain, soft light temperature in the low 60s, the harbor smelling of salt and distance. Jason dropped Thomas with Linda, who gave him a look so full of knowing he had to look away, and drove to Maggie's Diner on 5th Street. Nicole was already there when he arrived, sitting in the booth by the window, with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug. She was wearing jeans and a soft blue sweater, hair in a low ponytail, no jewelry. She looked nervous, which made him feel significantly better about his own nerves. Hi, she said, as he slid into the seat across from her. Hi. They looked at each other across the table, and Jason registered with a start that he had genuinely no idea how to do this. 7 years was a long time. Long enough to forget the particular social mechanics of sitting across from someone you wanted to impress while also trying to appear like you weren't trying to impress anyone. Sally, who had worked at Maggie's since the early 90s and had developed an almost supernatural ability to read tables, appeared and poured coffee without asking. Set down 2 laminated menus. What'll it be, Han? Pancakes, Jason said. Blueberry and the bacon. Nicole looked at her menu, Then she looked at him at the total confidence with which he'd ordered without consulting anything, and closed the menu. Same. Sally wrote it down and disappeared. Nicole tried the coffee and made a face. I know, Jason said. This is genuinely bad. The pancakes make you forget. You have an extraordinary amount of confidence in pancakes. I have an extraordinary amount of evidence. She laughed, the real one again, the one that didn't look like it had been prepared. He was realizing that Nicole Torres had two laughs, and the difference between them was significant. You didn't have to dress differently, he said. For this. She glanced down at herself. I didn't dress for this. This is just me. The other version is the armor. The armor version was also you. Yes, both are. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. The armor just takes more upkeep. Their food arrived faster than either of them expected. Maggie's had always moved at a pace that suggested mild urgency about getting to the next table, which Jason respected. Nicole looked at the stack of pancakes with the expression of someone facing something they'd been avoiding for longer than they'd intended. I haven't had pancakes in about 15 years, she said. A nutritionist in business school told me carbs were the enemy. Jason cut into his stack and took a deliberate, demonstrative bite. Your nutritionist was wrong. Nicole picked up her fork with the careful approach of someone who is prepared to be disappointed. The first bite made her eyes go wide. Oh my God! Told you! They ate in easy silence for a stretch, and Jason felt the knot of tension in his shoulders, the permanent tenant that had moved in around the time Linda got her diagnosis, loosened slightly. There was something about being here in this crappy diner, with its bad coffee and perfect pancakes, with someone who wasn't asking anything of him beyond his presence that felt like exhaling. Tell me about Thomas, Nicole said eventually. He talked about his son for longer than he'd planned. About Thomas's current conviction that velociraptors were actually small and covered in feathers, and that movies had gotten them wrong. About the dinosaur court proceeding from the previous Saturday, which had lasted an hour and involved multiple motions to suppress. About how Thomas sometimes asked questions at bedtime that required Jason to sit in the dark for a moment before answering because the questions were too good to rush. He asked me once, Jason said, why some families have moms and some don't. And I told him that families come in a lot of different shapes and that ours was the right shape for us. He thought about it for about 10 seconds and then he said, okay, but do you think dinosaurs had moms? He shook his head. 7 years old. Nicole was smiling with her whole face. He sounds like someone who's going to figure out how the world works before the world is ready for him. That's exactly what worries me, and exactly what I'm counting on. Nicole set her fork down. He asked about you, didn't he, before you came today? Jason looked at her. I told him I was meeting a friend. He asked if you were a girlfriend. What did you say? That you were a friend who happened to be a girl. He said that was the same thing. Then he told me his grandmother thinks I'm lonely. He pushed his pancakes around his plate. He's 7 years old and he's already doing better analysis than I am. Kids have the advantage of not knowing yet that honesty is supposed to be complicated. Nicole's voice had changed, slightly quieted. He's the reason you almost said no to this. He's the reason for most of my decisions. I understand. I need you to know that. She looked at him steadily across the table. His mother left. When he was 6 months old, signed the custody papers and was gone before I got home from work. I haven't heard from her in 7 years. Nicole absorbed this without the performative sympathy he'd learned to dread from people who didn't know what to do with hard facts. My mother died when I was 12, she said. Cancer. My father threw himself into work after and basically forgot I existed. So I know from a different angle, but I know what it costs a kid when the parent who's supposed to show up doesn't. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. I'm not asking you to be less careful with Thomas. I'm asking you to let me prove I can be careful too. He looked at their hands on the table. Hers smooth, his calloused and scarred from bar work, from the particular manual labor of a life built on not having other options. They didn't match by any visual logic, but they fit together anyway. Okay, he said quietly. They finished their pancakes and argued about the check. Nicole tried to pay for both. Jason insisted on splitting. They compromised on Jason leaving the tip. Outside the diner, they stood on the sidewalk in the October light, neither quite ready to end the morning. Can I see you again? Nicole asked. My schedule is insane. I know. You showed me. She had the particular composure of someone who'd already thought this through. I'm not asking for spontaneous. I don't need last minute. I can work with planned. Some weeks there won't be any time at all. I'll take whatever time there is. He pulled out his phone and showed her his calendar, a color-coded grid that looked like the operations board for a small military campaign. Work shifts in blue classes, in red Thomas's activities, in green Linda's appointments, in orange study blocks in gray. Almost no white space. Nicole studied it without the expression of someone calculating whether the return was worth the investment, which was what he'd been bracing for. Instead, she just looked at it like a logistics problem she was prepared to solve. Tuesday, she said, you've got 90 minutes between your shift and Thomas's bedtime. That's not enough for dinner. Then coffee, or just a walk. I don't need a production, Jason. I just want to spend time with you. Something in his chest let go of something it had been holding. Tuesday works. They made specific plans, times, and locations, written into the same calendar she'd just been looking at. As they said goodbye, Nicole leaned in and kissed his cheek. Quick light. The kind of contact that barely counted as contact. He felt it like a current. See you Tuesday, she said. He watched her walk to her car, the black sedan, that probably cost more than he'd make in 5 years of bar shifts, and stood on the sidewalk after she'd pulled away, trying to organize the information of the last 90 minutes into something that made sense. His phone buzzed. His mother. How did it go? Jason looked at the message for a moment. Then he typed back, good. Really good. Linda's reply was immediate. I knew it would be. Bring her home sometime. He laughed out loud alone on the sidewalk on 5th Street, and somewhere in the process of laughing, he noticed that the permanent knot in his shoulders had loosened another degree. Not gone. It was never entirely gone, but lighter than it had been in a long time. He drove home and spent the afternoon at Riverside Park with Thomas, pushing him on the swings and obligingly playing the role of the doomed ankylosaurus in an elaborate predator-prey scenario that Thomas had clearly been developing since breakfast. But part of his mind was already on Tuesday, already occupying the 90-minute gap in the color-coded grid, already counting down the hours in the particular helpless way of someone who has decided against their own better judgment. To want something. That night after Thomas was asleep and Linda had retreated to her room with her medications and her paperback, Jason sat at his desk and tried to work on his evidence paper and wrote exactly 40 words before giving up. He thought instead about Nicole's hand on his across the table at Maggie's. About the way she'd said, I'll take whatever time there is with the quiet certainty of someone stating a fact rather than making a promise. Nobody had ever said that before. Nobody had ever looked at the impossible architecture of his life and decided to fit into it rather than wait for it to become something more accommodating. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He wasn't sure he needed to do anything with it yet. He just let it be what it was, new and uncertain, and more hope than he'd allowed himself in, longer than he could precisely calculate. Outside his bedroom window, Ravenport's dock district sat quiet under the October sky. The harbor moved in its slow, indifferent way, and Jason Robinson, who had built his entire adult life around not reaching for things he couldn't keep, reached for the pencil on his desk and wrote one more sentence in the margin of his notes, not about evidence law, not about anything that would be on any exam. Maybe some things are worth the risk. He looked at it for a moment, then he turned the page and got back to work. The Tuesday coffee became a pattern, the way rivers become rivers, not through any single decision, but through the accumulated weight of water, finding the same channel again and again. 90 minutes at a place called Cornerstone Coffee on Delaney Street, 2 blocks from Thomas's school, close enough that Jason could walk to pick up on time. Nicole was always there first. She learned his order, black no sugar large, without being told. The way you learn someone's preferences when you're actually paying attention rather than waiting for them to tell you. They talked. That was the thing Jason hadn't fully anticipated, how much there was to say once he stopped rationing his words the way he rationed everything else. He told her about the drunk who tried to pay his tab with scratch tickets, about the evidence professor who communicated almost exclusively through rhetorical questions, about Thomas correcting his second-grade teacher's facts about velociraptor anatomy with enough specificity that the teacher had called Jason to report it. Though she'd been more impressed than annoyed. Nicole listened with the full attention of someone who had decided that this mattered, and when he stopped, she talked, and he listened the same way. She told him about a zoning dispute threatening a major commercial development in Hartford, not the financial details, which she kept vague, but the human architecture of it, the way every large transaction involved a dozen smaller conflicts between people who wanted incompatible things. She told him about a board member who had been her father's closest friend and who still couldn't quite see her when he looked at her, saw instead her father's name on the door, and made decisions based on what the name would have wanted. She told him slowly over several Tuesdays about what it had cost to rebuild the company from the inside out, not in dollars, but in sleep and time, and the particular kind of isolation that comes from being the person who makes the final call, always on everything. "Everybody in that building needs something from me," she said one Tuesday, 4 weeks in, wrapping both hands around her mug. "Approval, direction, money connections. Nobody just wants to sit and drink bad coffee and talk about their day." "This coffee isn't bad. This coffee is terrible, Jason." "It's decent." Her eyebrow went up. "You have significantly lowered your standards." "I've calibrated them to what's available." He leaned back in his chair. "There's a difference." She looked at him across the small table with something in her eyes that he was starting to recognize, not the assessing quality she'd walked into, the iron anchor with, but something warmer and more uncertain, the look of someone who is surprised to find themselves somewhere they want to be. He knew the feeling. He was wearing the same expression and doing a slightly better job of hiding it. They stayed until he had to leave for Thomas's pickup. At the car, Nicole hugged him, a real one. The kind with duration and intention, the kind that feels like something rather than nothing. He drove the 2 blocks to school with his heart doing something that had no practical justification and didn't require one. The pattern held through October and into November. Coffee on Tuesdays, brief walks on whatever Saturday afternoon offered a window in the grid, late phone calls after Thomas was asleep. Nicole's voice low and even in his ear, while he sat at his desk with the lamp on, and the apartment quiet around him, talking about nothing consequential, and somehow finding that nothing consequential was exactly what he needed. 3 weeks in, Linda cornered him in the kitchen on a Sunday morning with the directness she'd deployed his entire life whenever she decided he was being foolish in a way that required intervention. "When do I meet her?" Jason was making oatmeal and pretended to find the process more absorbing than it was. "It's still new." "It's been a month." "That's still new." Linda leaned against the counter with her arms crossed, the tremor in her right hand, less noticeable when she was still. "You smile at your phone differently." "I smile at my phone the same way I always have." "Thomas noticed too. He thinks you're texting a superhero." Jason set the spoon down. "I'm not ready for introductions." "It's still fragile," Linda finished. "I know. You've been protecting fragile things by keeping them small your whole life." Her voice was even but not unkind. "At some point, fragile things need air to grow, or they just stay fragile." He didn't have an answer for that, which was usually how he knew his mother was right. But he kept seeing Nicole, kept finding the gaps in the grid which Nicole had become extraordinarily good at locating, and kept falling in the slow, careful, terrified way of someone who knows exactly what's happening and is doing it anyway. The Sunday that changed things came at the end of November, the kind of gray Connecticut Sunday that makes the indoors feel like a mercy. They were at Riverside Park. Nicole had suggested a walk which had become one of their gap-filling habits, and the bare trees stood in lines along the path, the harbor visible in the distance through the branches. Thomas was at Linda's. The park was nearly empty. "What are you doing next Sunday?" Nicole asked. "Same as every Sunday. Laundry, groceries, convincing Thomas that carrots don't taste like punishment." "Can I help?" He stopped walking. She continued 2 steps and then stopped, turning back to look at him. The wind off the harbor moved through the bare trees with a sound like something being considered. "Help with what?" "All of it. The laundry, the groceries, the vegetable negotiations. Whatever Sunday actually looks like." "That's not a date." "I don't want a date." Her voice was steady, the particular steadiness of someone who has thought about what they're saying before they say it. "I want to be part of your actual life, not just the gaps in your schedule." The first instinct was no. It always was. Letting Nicole into a Sunday morning meant letting her into Thomas's world, which meant Thomas getting attached to someone who might not stay. which was the calculation Jason had been running since the night at the Iron Anchor. But he'd been doing the calculation for a month, and she'd shown up every single time, every Tuesday, every phone call, every Saturday window, and the math was starting to look different. Sunday mornings are chaos, he said. I can handle chaos. You say that? I mean it. He looked at her in the gray November light at the particular quality of her certainty, which was different from stubbornness. It was the certainty of someone who had made a clear-eyed decision and was prepared to stand behind it. Okay, he said, but I warned you. Nicole showed up at the apartment the following Sunday at 9 in the morning, wearing jeans and an old Dartmouth sweatshirt, hair in a loose bun. No briefcase, no coat worth more than a car. Nothing of the armor version, just her, looking somehow both more ordinary and more real than any previous version of herself he'd encountered. He buzzed her up with his heart doing the irrational thing it had been doing for a month. Linda was at the kitchen table with her newspaper and her coffee, and she looked at Nicole for approximately 3 seconds and made a decision that was visible on her face before she'd said a word. So you're the one, she said, and the warmth in it was so immediate that Nicole's composure flickered briefly, something unguarded crossing her expression. Nicole shook Linda's hand, and they sized each other up in the way of two people who both have a lot of data about a third person and are now comparing notes. He watched his mother's expression settle into something satisfied. He watched Nicole's settle into something careful and genuine. Then Thomas appeared. He came out of his bedroom clutching the Triceratops with the focused expression of a child conducting a serious evaluation. He looked at Nicole. She crouched down to his eye level without hesitating, not performing accessibility, just doing it the natural reflex of someone paying attention to where another person actually is. Your dad told me you know everything about dinosaurs, she said. Thomas studied her. I know a lot. Not everything. Nobody knows everything. That's a very honest answer. Dad says honesty is important even when it's harder. Nicole glanced up at Jason briefly, something warm moving through her eyes, then back to Thomas. Your dad's right. What's your favorite? Thomas held up the Triceratops. This one, because it was a herbivore, but it still had weapons. It didn't need to eat other animals to be dangerous. Nicole looked at the toy with genuine consideration. So it was strong without being aggressive. Thomas blinked, slightly thrown, that she'd understood it immediately. Yeah, exactly. He studied her another moment. Do you want to see my habitat project? It's almost done. He led her to his room, and Jason stood in the hallway, listening to his son explain the differences between Cretaceous and Jurassic ecosystems, with the focused enthusiasm of someone who has finally found an adult willing to take the subject seriously. And he felt something in the center of his chest that was too large and too specific for him to name, without it becoming terrifying. Linda appeared at his elbow. I like her, she said quietly. You've known her for 5 minutes. I've known everything I need to know since she got down to his level. His mother picked up her newspaper from the table and folded it. Stop looking for reasons to be afraid of good things. The laundromat on Oak Street was 3 blocks from the apartment, and Nicole came along without ceremony, helping Thomas sort darks from lights while Jason loaded the washers. His mother sat on the bench with a paperback, glancing up occasionally, with the expression of someone watching a play she'd been hoping to see for a long time. Thomas held up a red sock. This goes with colors. Reds go with colors, yes, Nicole confirmed, because red dye is unstable in hot water and it'll bleed onto everything else. What does bleed mean when it's about fabric? It means the color runs out of the fabric, like, have you ever left a crayon in your pocket and it went through the dryer? Thomas's eyes went wide with recognition. Dad had to throw away his work shirt. That's bleeding, Nicole kept sorting. Dye is basically just very small amounts of color that are attached to fibers. Wash them wrong and the attachment breaks. Thomas processed this. So colors have to be kept with other colors because they're unstable. Exactly, like some people. There was a pause. Nicole looked at Thomas. What do you mean? Some kids at school are unstable around new people. They act different until they know if you're safe. He held up a blue shirt. This goes with darks. Darks, Nicole confirmed and said nothing else, but Jason watched her absorb what his 7-year-old had just said without treating it as a child's nonsense, filing it somewhere real. At Green Valley Market, Thomas rode in the cart while Nicole pushed, and Jason navigated with the focused efficiency of someone who does the same grocery run every week and has optimized the route. He had a list. He worked the list. And then he caught Nicole reaching past him to put a container of strawberries in the cart while he was reading the back of a pasta sauce label. Those aren't on the list. Thomas should have fresh fruit. He has apples. Nicole looked at him with the patient expression of someone who has thought about this more than the moment suggests. Jason, if I want to buy your son strawberries, can you let me buy him strawberries without making it a referendum on your independence? Thomas was watching from the cart with the detached scientific interest of a researcher observing field subjects. Jason felt the tension in his jaw, the particular tension of a man who has spent 7 years being entirely responsible for everything and doesn't know how to let that go even when it's offered. Okay, he said quieter. Strawberries are fine. Thank you. Nicole nodded and they kept moving. The tension didn't entirely leave, but it changed from resistance to something more like recognition. He was aware of the pattern. He just hadn't figured out how to break it yet. Back at the apartment, while Linda and Thomas put groceries away in the practiced chaos of people who know where things go, Jason pulled Nicole into the hallway. I'm sorry about the store. You don't have to apologize. Yeah, I do. You were being generous and I made it into something else. Nicole leaned against the wall, studying him with the direct attention that had unsettled him the first night and had become something he looked forward to. You've been the only person responsible for everything for so long that accepting help feels like losing something. I understand that. A pause. But I need you to understand that when I do things for Thomas, it's not charity. It's not a transaction. It's just, she searched for the word care. That's all it is. He looked at her in the narrow hallway, the sounds of his family moving through the apartment on the other side of the wall. I know, he said. I'm working on it. I know you are. She held his gaze. I'm patient. They ordered pizza for lunch, and Thomas insisted Nicole sit next to him at the kitchen table where he delivered a comprehensive assessment of everyone in his class, their strengths, their social dynamics, their positions on the question of whether dinosaurs were more interesting than space, which Thomas considered a settled matter. Nicole listened with the focused interest she gave everything and asked follow-up questions that made Thomas progressively more animated, until he was talking with both hands and had forgotten to eat. Linda watched all of this from across the table with the expression of a woman who has prayed for something and is watching it arrive. After lunch, Nicole helped Thomas with the Habitat project, spreading construction paper and markers and modeling clay across the living room floor, building a Cretaceous landscape that included functional volcanoes made of rolled newspaper and a small herd of plastic herbivores gathered around a clay river. Jason sat across the room, supposedly working on a reading assignment and actually watching them. Nicole's hair had come entirely loose from the bun. There was green paint on her left hand. She was arguing seriously with Thomas about the correct placement of a Parasaurolophus. Linda appeared at Jason's elbow for the second time that day. You're falling for her. He kept his eyes on the reading, but the words had stopped registering. I know. And it scares you. Of course it does. Because everyone leaves. His mother's voice was gentle. Not a wound, just an acknowledgement. Your father, Sarah. People you counted on who decided they had better options. She set her hand briefly on his arm. But Jason, what if she doesn't leave? He looked through the doorway at Nicole, who was at that moment losing a good-natured argument about volcano placement to a 7-year-old and accepting the loss with complete grace. I don't know how to think that way yet. Then maybe that's the thing to work on. Linda moved back toward her chair, because she looks at him the way you hope someone would. That night, after Nicole had gone home and Thomas was asleep and Linda had taken her evening medications and retreated to her room, Jason sat on the building's roof, the flat, crumbling space he used when he needed to breathe without walls, and read Nicole's text from 20 minutes after she left. Thank you for today. Thomas is wonderful. You're wonderful. I know this is complicated, but I'm not going anywhere. He read it 3 times. Then he typed back, I'm not going anywhere either. Even the part of me that thinks I probably should be. Her response, don't run. I'm worth the risk. We are. He set the phone down and looked at the lights of Ravenport spread out below the rooftop edge. The harbor was a dark shape beyond them, marked by the lights of a container ship moving slowly toward open water. He thought about what his mother had said. about the thing he needed to work on, and he thought that maybe the working on it had already started. In the quiet of a Sunday afternoon with green paint on someone's hand, and his son losing an argument about volcanoes with total satisfaction. 2 weeks later, Jason was sitting in his evidence final when his phone began vibrating against his thigh. He'd silenced it. Phones were supposed to be off in exam rooms, and he'd set it to silent before entering, but he'd kept it on him because Thomas was with Linda and Sandra Anderson was nearby, and he had long ago decided that some rules were absolute and some required judgment. It vibrated again and again. The professor, Dr. Nguyen, looked up from her desk with the particular patience of someone who has seen this before and knows how it ends. Jason pulled the phone out under the desk. 7 missed calls from Sandra's number. 3 texts each more compressed than the last, the final one reading only hospital now. He stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. Every head in the room turned. He looked at Dr. Nguyen. Family emergency. I have to go. She started to speak something about protocol, about the exam, but something in his face stopped her. Go, she said. We'll sort out the exam. He ran. 3 blocks to his car, genuinely ran, his lungs burning in the cold December air, the phone already against his ear. Sandra picked up on the second ring, her voice carrying the particular calm of someone who has been in enough emergencies to know that calm is the most useful thing you can offer. She collapsed about 40 minutes ago. She came around, but her heart rate was irregular. We're at Ravenport General. I'm coming. He was already in the car. Jason. A pause. She's stable right now. Drive safely. He drove faster than safely, but not faster than necessary, which was a distinction he'd learned from years of being the person who got the calls. Linda was in room 14 when he arrived, not the ER this time. They'd moved her to a monitored room, which was either better or worse than the ER, depending on how you read it. She had an IV in her arm and a blood pressure cuff and a pulse oximeter, and she looked smaller than she had when he'd left her that morning. Not frightened. Linda Robinson had never in his memory looked frightened, but reduced somehow like a tide going out. Sandra met him in the corridor outside. She was in her early 50s and had the posture of someone who had absorbed a great deal of difficult information without being destroyed by it, which was one of the things he'd been grateful for since she'd come into their lives. She was on the couch. I was in the kitchen. I heard her go down. Sandra's voice remained steady and factual. She was conscious when I got to her, but confused for a few minutes. Her heart rate was all over the place. I called for the ambulance over her objections. Good, thank you. Dr. Lee is with her now. Dr. Kenneth Lee had been managing Linda's care for 14 months, and he stepped out of room 14 with the expression of a man who has learned to deliver difficult information with precision rather than softness. He pulled Jason a few feet down the corridor. Her condition is progressing. The medication regimen we've been using isn't holding as well as we'd hoped. He held Jason's gaze. There's a clinical trial beginning next month at this hospital. It's shown meaningful results in cases with her profile. The treatment is intensive, 3 sessions a week, substantial side effects, but the trial data is promising. Jason processed this the way he processed everything he didn't want to be true, methodically, the way you inventory damage before deciding what to do about it. What if she doesn't participate? Then we continue symptom management and focus on quality of life? Dr. Lee's voice was even and not unkind. But Jason, you need to understand what that timeline looks like. We're talking about months. The word landed like something dropped from height. Months was not years. Months had a particular meaning when it came from a physician in a hospital corridor. Jason put his hand flat against the wall and pressed until he felt the cold surface against his palm, grounding himself in the physical fact of it. She'll also need daily care at home, Dr. Lee continued. The falls are increasing in frequency. She shouldn't be alone during the day. I work, I have school, I know, and I'm not telling you what's possible. I'm telling you what's necessary. Those 2 things are going to need to become the same thing somehow. Jason nodded. Went into room 14. Linda was sitting up slightly, the look on her face. The particular look she got when she was in discomfort and determined not to perform it. He sat in the chair beside her bed, and she put her hand over his, and they were quiet for a moment, which was sometimes the only appropriate response to the size of a thing. I already told Dr. Lee, yes, Linda said. About the trial, he looked at her. While you were in the hallway, I heard you processing your crisis, sweetheart, and I didn't want to wait. Her grip on his hand tightened slightly. If there's a chance this buys me more time with Thomas, I'm taking it, even if the treatment is awful. Especially if the treatment is awful because that means it's working hard. Relief moved through him, followed immediately by the sharp awareness of everything the yes required. The daily care, the transportation, the gap between what insurance covered and what the trial actually cost, the impossible arithmetic of his schedule against this new weight. Mom, we need to talk about what you're going to need at home. I know what I need. I need you to stop trying to carry this alone. His phone buzzed. He looked at it out of habit. Nicole, how did the exam go? He stared at the message for a moment, then typed back with hands that weren't entirely steady. At the hospital, Mom collapsed. The response came in under a minute. Which hospital he sent it before he decided he was going to. And 16 minutes later, which was faster than the distance should have allowed, Nicole Torres walked through the door of room 14, still in the blazer she'd been wearing, to whatever meeting she'd left. She didn't say anything when she found him in the corridor outside the room. She just looked at his face and then pulled him into a hug, and he let himself lean into it for a long moment with his eyes closed, breathing through the weight of the afternoon, feeling the particular relief of not having to hold it entirely upright by himself. When he pulled back and told her everything, Dr. Lee's assessment, the clinical trial, the need for daily in-home care, the financial gap, Nicole listened without interrupting. She had a quality he'd noticed before and continued to find remarkable. She was genuinely still when someone else was talking, not preparing her response, just receiving the information. When he finished, she said, "Let me hire a home health aide." The resistance came up immediately and completely. This isn't strawberries. No, it's your mother's life and your son's stability and your ability to finish law school without destroying yourself. Her voice was even. Those things matter to me. I can't let you pay for that. Why not? Because I can't pay you back. Because it's too much. Because I don't. He stopped, found the honest thing underneath the other things. Because I don't know how to be in debt to someone I'm falling in love with. It changes the math of everything. Nicole looked at him steadily. The fluorescent lights in the corridor were the particular flat white of hospital lighting, which reveals everything and flatters nothing. And in that light, she looked completely serious and completely certain. Accepting help isn't weakness, she said quietly. It's just a different kind of strength, the kind that's harder to learn. A beat. You've been the strongest person in every room you've ever been in. Just try being the person who lets someone else carry something. Once. See what it feels like. He pressed the flat of his hand against the wall again. Breathed. I don't know how to say yes to this. Start with okay. The rest is just logistics. Linda's voice carried through the partially open door of room 14. Jason, she's right. I can hear you both. Say okay and let the woman help. The sound that came out of him was something between a laugh and a breath. Nicole's expression relaxed fractionally. Okay, he said. Thank you. Nicole went to pick up Thomas from school because Sandra needed to stay with Linda and Jason needed to be at the hospital and Thomas needed to be somewhere familiar and calm with someone who knew how to be calm. He watched her leave and thought, this is what it looks like when someone actually shows up. Not the performance of it, the actual thing. He went back into room 14 and sat with his mother, and they talked about the trial and about what the daily care would look like and about practical things. The way they'd always talked about practical things when the emotional things were too large for words. Linda asked about Nicole. He said she'd gone to get Thomas. Linda looked at him with the particular expression she'd worn his entire life when she was letting him come to something on his own. I might be in love with her, he said. It was the first time he'd said it out loud to anyone, including himself. Linda's expression didn't change. I know, sweetheart. I've known for about 3 Sundays. Sandra Anderson came to the apartment the following week for the interview. She was 52 and carried herself with the contained competence of someone who had spent 2 decades doing hard work without requiring recognition for it. She sat across the kitchen table from Jason and Nicole and Linda. Linda had insisted on being part of the process, had in fact positioned herself at the head of the table in a way that made clear she was evaluating the candidates rather than being assessed, and stated her terms without preamble. I don't do drama and I don't do games. I show up on time, I do my job and I do it well, and I treat patients like human beings with opinions and preferences rather than medical cases to be managed. Her eyes moved to Linda. I assume you have a lot of opinions and preferences. Linda's face broke into something rare and genuine. More than most people can handle. Good, I can handle a lot. Sandra folded her hands on the table. When do you need me to start? Nicole handled the financial details after Sandra left efficiently, without discussion the way she handled logistics, which was by identifying the fastest path from problem to solution and taking it. When Jason tried to raise the cost, she cut him off with the brisk certainty of someone who had already done the math. My annual bonus alone would cover this for years. This is not a sacrifice. This is me using money for something that actually matters. She looked at him. Please stop trying to argue about things that are already decided. Linda from the couch. Listen to her, Jason. He let it go. Mostly. The part of him that had learned independence as a survival skill didn't stop registering the debt, but he got better at setting that register aside. The clinical trial began on a Tuesday in mid-December. Jason took the shift off to go with Linda to the first session, Sandra driving Jason in the back, with his mother, the three of them moving through the gray winter morning with a quiet that wasn't uncomfortable. The treatment room was cold and institutional, and Linda sat in the chair with the IV and the equipment and the attentive nurses with the complete composure of someone who had decided to treat the indignity of illness as a logistics problem rather than an emotional one. She cracked a joke with the nurse about the temperature of the room. She asked Jason about his evidence paper. She was, as she had always been, more interested in other people's experiences than in her own discomfort. On the drive home, when the composure had been set aside because the car was private, that was thoroughly unpleasant. Do you want to stop? She looked out the passenger window at the winter gray Connecticut landscape moving past. No, I want to see Thomas get old enough to argue with me. A pause. I want to see where this thing with you and Nicole goes. The second treatment was harder. The third was harder still, the side effects the trial doctors had warned about arriving in full, and leaving Linda pale and depleted in the passenger seat, Sandra watching her vitals with the steady vigilance of long experience. Jason drove home with his hands tight on the wheel and the particular specific helplessness of watching someone you love suffer something you cannot fix. That night on the roof, the December cold sharp and clear, he told Nicole what he was afraid to say in the apartment. What if the treatment is worse than what it's treating? What if we're putting her through this and it doesn't? Then that's her choice to make, Nicole said. Her shoulder was against his, her voice steady in the cold air. You can hate watching it. You can wish it were different, but you can't take the decision away from her because you love her. I know, and you're not watching it alone. He found her hand in the dark and held it without saying anything else. Below them, Ravenport's lights spread toward the harbor. The cold worked through his jacket, and he didn't move. Neither did she. The Thursday it broke open was an ordinary Thursday. Jason was midway through a reasonable shift at the Iron Anchor, not busy, not slow, the particular middle state of a weeknight in December, when he heard his phone buzz in his pocket with the distinctive pattern Sandra used for calls he needed to take. He finished serving the customer in front of him, moved to the end of the bar and answered. She's okay, Sandra said immediately, which told him Linda wasn't okay. But you should come home. He told his manager he had a family situation, received the resigned nod of someone who had heard this enough times to have stopped being surprised by it, and was out the door in 45 seconds. Sandra met him at the apartment door, looking composed in the way that required active effort. Linda was on the couch, her color wrong, her breathing too careful. Thomas was at Mrs. Patterson's across the hall. She went down in the kitchen, Sandra said quietly. Back up within a minute, but her heart rate pattern worries me. She wouldn't let me call for an ambulance. Linda looked up at Jason with the expression she wore when she'd already anticipated the argument and was prepared to win it. I'm not going back to that hospital tonight. I just came from treatment this morning. I need to rest in my own home. You fell. I got dizzy. It happens. More often lately. Yes. She held his gaze. And I'm still choosing to be here in this apartment in my own bed. That is my choice to make. He looked at Sandra, who gave him the small, honest shake of her head that meant she's right, that it's her choice, even if I'm not sure it's the right choice. He sat down across from his mother, and they looked at each other in the lamp-lit room, and he felt the particular grief of watching someone you love make a decision you can't overrule, and knowing you wouldn't want to overrule it even if you could, because the decision comes from the same place in her that you love most. If it happens again, he said finally, I'm calling the ambulance myself. If it happens again, Linda said, I'll let you. Sandra helped Linda to her bedroom. Jason called Mrs. Patterson, who told him Thomas was fine and could stay as long as needed, then sat down at the kitchen table and called Nicole. She answered before the second ring. Her voice was warm and immediately present. Hey, I was just thinking about, can you come over? He stopped. Found the honest thing. I need you here. A pause that lasted less than 2 seconds. I'm on my way. She brought food takeout from the Italian place on Mercer Street, which she'd learned he kept as a backup option when cooking wasn't possible, and found him at the kitchen table staring at the middle distance, with the expression of a man who has been holding too many things for too long and is starting to feel the weight. She set the bags down, sat across from him, and waited. He told her everything. The fall, Sandra's face, his mother's voice making the choice with complete clarity, the fear that had lived in him since Dr. Lee's words in the corridor, months, not years, and that had been present in every room since a low hum he'd learned to function around. Nicole listened all the way through. Then, when's the last time you ate? He genuinely couldn't remember. She opened the bags and set food in front of him, with the practical care of someone who understands that grief needs a body to live in, and bodies need fuel. He ate without tasting it, and she sat across from him and was present in the way she'd been present in the hospital corridor, not trying to fix it, not filling the silence with reassurance, just there. Sandra came out of Linda's room around 11 with the composed expression of someone whose patient's vitals have settled into acceptable ranges. She's resting. Pulse is regular now. I'll stay the night. She looked at Jason. Go be with your son. Maintain his routine. That's the most useful thing you can do. Mrs. Patterson sent Thomas home with a chocolate smudge on his face and considerably more energy than a child should have at 9:30 at night. He ran in on, registered Nicole's presence with obvious relief, registered his grandmother's absence with the careful alertness he'd developed over a year of learning to read the apartment's emotional weather. Is Nana okay? She's resting, Nicole said at the same level. She had a hard day, but she's okay right now. Thomas processed this. Okay. He looked at his father. Are you okay? Getting there, Jason said. Come on, bed. He got Thomas through the routine teeth pajamas, Triceratops positioned correctly lamp off, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, until Thomas asked the question that had been building since he walked in the door. Is Nana going to die? The question had the particular weight of a question asked by someone who already knows part of the answer and is hoping the adult will fill in the rest with something bearable. Jason sat with it for a moment before answering. She's sick, and the doctors are working hard to help her, but sometimes, even when people try very hard, things don't turn out the way we want. That's not fair. No, it's not. If she dies, Thomas said in the steady voice of someone being very brave, will you still be okay? Will we? Jason reached out and found his son's shoulder in the dark. Yeah, buddy, we'll be okay. We always find a way to be okay. What about Nicole? A pause. I asked her last week if she was going to leave. She said love means staying even when it's hard. She said that's the whole point of it. Thomas shifted under the blanket. Is she going to stay? Jason thought about Nicole in the hospital corridor saying accepting help isn't weakness. He thought about her in this apartment on a Sunday with green paint on her hand taking Thomas's volcanoes seriously. He thought about the food on the table that he hadn't remembered to get and the voice on the phone that had said I'm on my way without a single qualifying pause. Yeah, he said, she's going to stay. Good. Thomas reached up and found Jason's hand in the dark and held it for a moment, the small, warm grip of someone who trusts the answer, even when they know the world doesn't guarantee it. I like her, Dad. She doesn't treat me like a kid. You are a kid. I know, but she doesn't treat me like a stupid one. After Thomas's breathing evened out, Jason found Nicole in the kitchen, finishing the cleanup from the takeout bags. Moving quietly so she wouldn't wake anyone, her hair falling loose from whatever it had been pinned in. She'd taken off her blazer and rolled up her sleeves and was washing the containers with the focused efficiency of someone who knows how to make themselves useful in an unfamiliar kitchen. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment. She looked up. "He's asleep," Jason said. "I know. I could tell when you stopped moving around in there." He crossed the kitchen and leaned against the counter beside her close enough to feel her warmth in the cool apartment. "Why are you doing all of this?" She dried her hands on a dish towel, turned to face him. "Because I care about you, about Linda, about Thomas." Her eyes were steady and direct. "I know that's not a complicated answer, but it's the true one. Most people would have left by now. I'm not most people, a beat, and I'm not here because any of this is convenient or easy. I'm here because when I'm with you, I remember what it feels like to be a person instead of a function, to want something for its own sake, and not because it returns something measurable." She looked at him with an openness he'd seen build over weeks, something she'd been working toward letting him see. "You are the first real thing I've found in a very long time, and I'm not walking away from real." Jason looked at her in the dim kitchen with the sounds of the sleeping apartment around them. He thought about the wall he'd built, about how long it had been since he decided not to reach for things, about his son in the dark, a room away, asking if she was going to stay. "I love you," he said. The words came out rough from disuse, like something that had been stored somewhere without ventilation and needed air. "I didn't plan to. I did everything I could not to, but I do." Nicole's expression moved through something complicated and landed somewhere certain. She stepped forward and kissed him, not urgently, but with the particular quality of something that has been true for a while and is finally being acknowledged. He put his arms around her and held on, feeling the warm, solid reality of her against the cold fear of the day, and let himself believe just for this moment that it might be possible to hold good things without losing them. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. Outside the kitchen window, the December wind moved through Ravenport streets, and somewhere in the building a door closed, and the city went on being itself, indifferent and continuous. "We're going to get through this," she said. "All of it." "You sound sure of that." "I am, because I don't give up on things that matter." She pulled back just enough to look at him. "And you matter, Jason Robinson. You and Thomas and Linda, you all matter." He didn't argue. He was too tired to argue and too relieved to want to. And somewhere underneath both of those things was the tentative, terrifying beginning of actually believing her. The trial report came 16 days later on a morning so cold, the harbor was throwing off a light mist that settled on every surface and made Ravenport look briefly like something from a painting. Jason was in his car outside the hospital, having driven Linda to what was supposed to be a routine monitoring appointment after the 7th treatment session when Sandra's name appeared on his phone. His stomach dropped before he answered. "Dr. Lee wants to see you both," Sandra said. "Conference room 2. He said to tell you it's not bad news." He said those words specifically. Conference room 2 held a table, 4 chairs, and Dr. Kenneth Lee with a file folder and an expression that Jason had not seen on him before, something that looked after a moment's study like satisfaction. Linda sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap and the contained alertness of someone who has learned to wait without performing either hope or despair. "The lab work from this week," Dr. Lee said, opening the folder and turning it so they could both see the numbers, "shows significant improvement in the key markers we've been tracking." He pointed to a column of figures that meant more to him than to them, but his voice carried the meaning clearly enough. "The trial protocol is working. We're not talking about remission, I want to be precise about that, but we are talking about measurable, meaningful progress. The trajectory has changed." Jason heard the words but had to run them through twice before they connected to anything. Changed how? Changed in the direction of more time. Considerably more time if this trend holds. Dr. Lee looked at Linda directly. "We were talking about months. Now we're talking about years." The word years had a weight to it that was entirely different from its weight in ordinary sentences. It landed in Jason's chest and he felt something give way there, something that had been braced against a particular pressure for so long that the release of it was almost physical. Beside him, Linda made a sound that she immediately controlled back into composure, But her eyes were bright and her hands still folded in her lap had gone tight. She fought through the worst of the side effects. Dr. Lee continued looking at Jason. That decision to stay with the protocol when it was most difficult, that's what made the difference. It takes time for these treatments to establish efficacy. She gave it the time it needed. Jason looked at his mother. She looked at him. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and for a long moment neither of them said anything, because some things are too large for immediate words and require instead the simple fact of presence. He called Nicole from the parking lot, his voice doing something unsteady that he couldn't entirely control. She answered on the first ring. He told her. She didn't say anything for a moment, and in the silence he heard her breath change. Then, "I'm coming." "You don't have to." "I know." A pause. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. She arrived in 19, and when she came across the parking lot toward him, with the winter mist moving around her, and her face full of something open and unguarded, he understood something he hadn't fully articulated before she had been carrying this with him. Not as a bystander, not as a witness, but as someone with actual stakes in the outcome, someone for whom years meant the same kind of relief it meant for him. She had earned the right to feel this. He pulled her into a hug in the parking lot of Ravenport General in the December cold and held on for a long time. "Years," he said against her shoulder. "Years," she said back. "That's enough time for a lot of things." He thought about Thomas, who had asked if his grandmother would be around long enough to see him grow up. He thought about what enough time could mean, what it could hold. He thought about the way Nicole had looked at him across a ruined kitchen in the middle of the night and said, "You are the first real thing I've found." Above them, the winter mist moved through the Ravenport air, and the harbor went on, turning its slow, patient circle. And somewhere on the other side of the city, Thomas Robinson was in school learning about ecosystems, not knowing yet that the news from room 14 had changed the shape of things. Tonight, Jason would tell him, and the word years, which had been so heavy coming from Dr. Lee in that corridor months ago, would become something else entirely, would become in Thomas's face. Exactly what it was: an open door. The job offers came on the same Tuesday in late January, 12 days apart, but arriving in Jason's awareness simultaneously, the way certain problems wait until you're already carrying something heavy before they add their weight. The first was from the Ravenport District Attorney's Office entry-level prosecutor, exactly the position he'd been training toward. The logical endpoint of 7 years of bar shifts and night classes and a debt load that made his stomach tighten when he thought about it directly. The second came from a nonprofit legal clinic in Portland, Oregon, called the Cascadia Innocence Project, which handled wrongful conviction cases and paid 20% less than the DA's offer, and was 12 hours away by car. He sat with both letters on the kitchen table for 3 days without telling anyone. He read them in the morning before Thomas woke up, and in the evenings after Thomas was asleep, turning them over, the way you turn over something that has no obviously right answer, and you know it. The DA's position was everything he'd said he wanted when people asked what he wanted, which was different from what he actually wanted, which he'd only admitted clearly to himself once late at night on a rooftop. Saying it the way you say things you're not sure you're allowed to want. That accountability meant more to him when it ran in the direction of people who'd had the system used against them instead of for them. The Innocence Project was that. The DA's office was the other thing: respectable, proximate, practical. He told Nicole on a Thursday evening on the roof, the February cold sharp enough to make their breath visible. The harbor lights below doing their usual indifferent thing. He laid it out plainly: both offers, both locations, both salaries, and then he stopped talking and waited. Nicole was quiet long enough that he started to wonder what she was calculating. Then, take the Portland job. You haven't heard the argument against it. Make it anyway. He made it. Portland was 12 hours away. Nicole's company was headquartered in Ravenport. Linda's clinical trial was anchored to Dr. Lee, and this hospital and this protocol. Thomas was stable at his school, had developed something approaching friendship with 2 kids in his class, had finally gotten a teacher who understood that correcting the lesson plan was Thomas's version of enthusiasm rather than defiance. Everything Jason had spent 7 years building was here in this specific city, in this specific grid of obligations and relationships. Nicole listened to all of it. Then she took out her phone and opened a message thread and handed it to him without commentary. The thread was with Dr. Kenneth Lee. It had started 3 weeks ago when Jason had mentioned the Innocence Project application in passing. The way you mentioned something you've half decided isn't possible. Nicole had texted Dr. Lee the following morning, asking whether comparable clinical trials existed at Portland area hospitals. Dr. Lee had responded within the day with a name Dr. Brian Thompson at Portland General, running an identical protocol with comparable results. The thread ended with Dr. Lee's confirmation that he could transfer Linda's care file with full continuity of treatment. Jason read the thread twice. Then he looked at Nicole. You started planning this before I had an offer. I started the day you mentioned applying. Her voice was even certain in the way it got when she'd thought something through completely. I wanted you to decide without the weight of feeling like you were asking me for something. The thing about Nicole Torres, which Jason had understood incrementally over months and now understood fully, was that she operated several moves ahead, not from calculation, but from care. She thought about what the people she loved needed before they knew they needed it. The way his mother had always known when he was sick before he admitted he felt wrong. It was the same instinct wearing a different face. You were going to move across the country for me, he said. For us. A small, definitive correction. There's a difference. He looked at her in the cold February dark the city spread below them and felt something shift in his chest that had been braced in position since the night she'd walked into the Iron Anchor, some last piece of the architecture he'd built to keep himself safe, releasing its hold. She had thought about Portland before he had. She had solved the problem of his mother's care before he'd known it was a problem to solve. She had, without announcement, made herself part of the structure of his life in the same quiet, consistent way that she made herself useful everywhere she went, not by taking over, but by paying enough attention to know where to stand. I need to talk to Thomas and Linda first, he said. This affects them. Of course. She took her phone back. But Jason, I think they'll surprise you. He told them the next morning at breakfast, which was the Robinson household's traditional venue for information that required full processing. Thomas ate cereal with the focused attention of someone storing data. Linda drank her coffee and looked at the middle distance in the way she looked at things that required her to think before she reacted. Jason laid it out the same way he'd laid it out for Nicole. Both offers Portland the distance what it would require of all of them. He didn't editorialize. He wanted them to reach their own conclusions without his thumb on the scale. Linda spoke first. I go where you go. That's been true since you were born, and it hasn't changed. Thomas set down his spoon. He looked at his father with the particular seriousness he brought to questions that he'd already been thinking about privately for some time. Would Nicole come? That's something Nicole and I would need to figure out. But probably. Thomas picked up his spoon again, ate a careful bite. Then, Marcus is moving to Florida because his dad got transferred. I was going to have to make new friends at recess anyway. He looked up. And you always tell me to try hard at things that actually matter. You look different when you talk about the wrongful conviction work. You look like you do when I say something that's actually interesting, like you're paying attention for real. Jason looked at his son across the breakfast table and felt something he didn't have an immediate word for, something between pride and humility. The feeling of being seen accurately by someone who loves you enough to be honest. When did you get so perceptive? Thomas shrugged with the composure of someone accepting a compliment without being derailed by it. I learned from you. You always said pay attention to the thing underneath the thing people say. The real thing. He took another bite. Portland has a big natural history museum. Nicole showed me. Jason looked at Nicole, who was studying her coffee with the expression of someone who is aware they've been caught doing something and has decided the best response is to let it land without defense. You showed him pictures. I wanted to see if he'd hate the idea before I brought it up to you. A pause. He didn't hate it. I liked it, Thomas said helpfully. The museum has a full Allosaurus skeleton. Articulated. Linda set down her mug. Her smile was the kind she got when she'd been hoping for something for long enough that watching it happen felt more like recognition than surprise. Say yes, Jason. Do the work you actually want to do. We'll handle the rest together. He looked around the table at his mother's steady certainty, at his son's earnest pragmatism, at Nicole's careful composure, at the remains of a breakfast in an apartment that had held 7 years of his life and was ready, apparently, to let him take what mattered and move. 2 weeks later, he called the Innocence Project and accepted. The 3 months between the acceptance and the move were the fullest and most logistically complex of Jason's life, which was a significant distinction given that his life had not historically been light on logistics. There were leases to end and a new one to sign, a furniture situation that resolved itself when Nicole sold most of hers without apparent sentiment and said the penthouse had never contained anything she'd miss. There was Thomas's school enrollment to arrange. Linda's medical records to transfer. Sandra Anderson to negotiate with. She agreed to relocate after approximately 48 hours of deliberation, which Jason suspected she'd already been considering before he asked. Nicole handled the company restructuring with the efficiency of someone who had been planning it longer than she admitted. She promoted her COO to a role with full operational authority, restructured the board reporting schedule to quarterly in-person meetings with everything else handled remotely, and filed the paperwork for a new registered agent in Connecticut the same week. When Jason expressed concern that she was dismantling something she'd spent years building, she looked at him with the flat patience of someone who has already resolved an argument before it started. I built the company to prove something to a dead man. I don't need to keep proving it. A beat. I need to be somewhere that matters. You're somewhere that matters. He graduated in May on a morning that arrived with the particular generosity of New England spring, warm and clear in the way that makes the previous winter feel like something you imagine. The gown he rented was 2 inches short in the sleeve, which he didn't notice until he was in the procession. The ceremony took place at the Ravenport Civic Center, a building he'd driven past 1,000 times without ever being inside. And when he walked across the stage, his name was announced into a room where Thomas Robinson was making enough noise for 6 people, and Nicole was recording on her phone, despite 3 visible signs prohibiting recording, and Linda was in the wheelchair she'd agreed to use for distances after the last fall, crying without self-consciousness in the front section of the reserved seating. He found them after in the crowd of graduates and families in the particular chaos of a day where everyone is simultaneously trying to document and experience the same moment. Thomas launched himself with the force of a child who has been sitting still for 2 hours and has reached his absolute limit. The impact was considerable. Jason caught him. You're a lawyer now, Thomas announced. Not yet. Bar exam first. But you will be. I will be. Because you don't quit. Thomas said it with the certainty of someone stating a law of physics. You never quit on stuff that matters. Nicole appeared beside them, phone still raised, capturing the moment for the family archive she'd been building since the laundromat. Jason looked at her over Thomas's head, and she looked back, and something passed between them that didn't require words, the acknowledgement of how long this specific day had been in the making. How many 4 a.m. study sessions and double shifts and impossible schedule grids it had required, and what it meant to have arrived at it with people standing next to you. Linda reached up from the wheelchair and took his hand. I'm so proud of you, she said. So proud. Couldn't have done it without you. You could have. Her grip tightened slightly. But I'm glad you didn't have to. Nicole had made dinner reservations at a restaurant downtown that was a significant step up from Maggie's Diner, which was the point. This was the occasion for the step up. And she'd made the reservation 3 weeks earlier, knowing he'd object, and had simply not told him until the morning of. He objected briefly in the parking lot of the Civic Center. She didn't engage with the objection. They went. Thomas ordered the most expensive item on the menu with the calm deliberation of a child who has been told this is a celebration dinner and has decided to take that seriously. Linda made it through most of her meal before the fatigue from the ceremony caught up with her, but she stayed at the table, refusing Sandra's suggestion that they could get the rest to go because she wanted to be present for all of it. Nicole raised her glass for a toast, and Thomas raised his water glass with matching formality. Nicole said, 2 years ago, I walked into a bar expecting to win a bet. The table went quiet in a way that had a particular texture. Jason's fork stopping partway to his plate, Thomas looking between the adults with the alert expression of someone detecting information. What bet? Thomas asked. Nicole set her glass down. She looked at Jason first in acknowledgement, then at Thomas. My best friend Rachel told me I was too focused on work to actually connect with anyone. She bet me $10,000 that I couldn't make a regular person fall in love with me in 3 months. I took the bet because I never lose. A pause. Your dad was the person I walked in to meet. Jason put his fork down the rest of the way. The restaurant continued around them, other tables, other conversations, the ambient sound of an ordinary celebration dinner, and inside that sound, the table held a specific and weighted silence. Thomas looked at his father. Did you know? No. Thomas looked at Nicole. His expression was the unreadable one he got when he was processing something substantial. When did it stop being a bet? About a week in. When I realized your dad wasn't something I could manage or calculate or win. He was just real, and I hadn't been around real in a long time. She held Thomas's gaze steadily. I should have told your dad sooner. I didn't because I was afraid of losing something I'd already decided mattered more than the bet. Thomas sat with this for a moment. Then, did you pay Rachel? I told her the bet was off. She said I lost anyway. Nicole's mouth curved slightly. She was right. Thomas turned back to his food with the air of someone who has received sufficient data and reached a conclusion. Okay. He picked up his fork. Can I get the chocolate lava cake for dessert? Jason looked at Nicole across the table. She was watching him with the careful attention of someone who has just said a true and difficult thing and is waiting to understand what it costs. He thought about all the ways he could respond to anger, which would be performative, distance, which would be self-protective, the elaborate analytic process of unpacking what it meant that their beginning had been something other than what he'd believed it was. He ran through all of those, and then he set them aside because none of them accounted for the full picture, which was a woman who had started something as a game and then done every single thing that followed because she meant it. The game had lasted a week. Everything else had lasted considerably longer and had cost her considerably more. You're terrible at cons, he said. Nicole blinked. What? If you were actually running a game, you would have kept the bet secret forever. You wouldn't have hired Sandra or moved into my apartment or spent your evenings doing dishes in a kitchen the size of a closet. He looked at her steadily. You told me because you don't want secrets between us. That's not how people behave when they're playing an angle. That's how they behave when they love someone and can't keep carrying the weight of the thing they didn't say. Her composure held, but something behind it shifted, softened. Are you sure you're not angry? I was for about 30 seconds. Then I did the math. He picked up his fork. You owe Rachel $10,000. I already paid her. She donated it to a children's hospital and told me I was an idiot for almost letting you get away. A beat. I thought she was being dramatic. Smart woman. Thomas had been listening to all of this with the focused patience of a child who knows he's witnessing something important and has decided not to interrupt it. Now he said, so the reason Nicole came to the bar was a bet, but the reason she stayed wasn't. That's right, Jason said. Thomas nodded, slowly processing. That's like how I didn't want to like broccoli, but then I did. The reason you start something and the reason you keep doing it can be different. Nicole looked at Thomas with an expression Jason had come to recognize, the one that appeared when his son said something that arrived at a truth from a direction no adult had considered. Yes, she said, exactly like that. That night after Sandra had taken Linda home and Thomas was asleep in the back seat of Nicole's car on the drive back from the restaurant, Jason brought it up again in the particular quiet of the car's interior, the highway dark around them, Thomas's breathing slow and even from the back. Why did you really tell me tonight? He asked. You could have kept it forever. Rachel wasn't going to say anything. Nicole kept her eyes on the road for a moment. Because Rachel's getting married in August and she wants me to be in the wedding, which means you'll meet her. A pause. I didn't want you to find out from someone else in the middle of a wedding reception. You deserved to hear it from me, with time to respond however you needed to. You told me to protect me from being blindsided. Yes, that's different from telling me because you felt guilty. I felt guilty too. She glanced at him briefly, then back to the road. But mostly I want us to be honest with each other. As a baseline, even when honesty is the harder option. A beat. I've spent most of my adult life optimizing for the easier option, and it left me sitting alone in a bar, in a storm, talking to a stranger, because strangers were the only people who weren't asking me for something. Jason looked out the passenger window at the dark Connecticut highway. Behind them, Thomas slept with the Triceratops tucked against his side, carried to the restaurant and back without comment from the adults because some things were simply understood. "I'm glad you walked in," he said, "even knowing how it started, especially knowing how it started, because the how doesn't change the what." He turned to look at her profile in the dashboard light. "You lost the bet. Best loss I ever took." They drove the rest of the way home in the particular comfortable quiet of people who have said the necessary things and can now simply be in each other's presence without performance or maintenance. The radio low, the highway lights moving past in their regular rhythm. The night holding everything with its usual patient indifference. The move to Portland happened in late June, in 2 days of driving that Thomas narrated with the comprehensive attention to detail of someone who intended to produce a full report. They stopped at a motel in upstate New York the first night. Inexpensive, clean. Thomas's assessment of the vending machine selection, thorough and enthusiastic. Linda rode with Sandra in the second car, the pace calibrated to what the drives after treatment had established as her sustainable range. Somewhere in central Pennsylvania, Nicole texted Jason from the car ahead. "There's a roadside attraction in 40 miles. World's largest beaver dam replica. Thomas would love it." He texted back, "Don't." She texted back, "Already mentioned it." From the back seat, Thomas, who had been reading, looked up with sudden intensity. "Dad, world's largest beaver dam." They stopped. It was exactly as underwhelming as Jason anticipated and exactly as interesting as Thomas hoped. A structure of genuine scale in a parking lot off the highway, commemorated with a historical placard and a gift shop. Thomas stood in front of it with the focused reverence he reserved for things that represented either scientific achievement or extreme effort, which this arguably was both. Nicole took photographs for the archive. Sandra bought Thomas a small commemorative beaver because she had developed over months of proximity a thorough understanding of what mattered to him. Linda stood at the edge of the parking lot looking at the structure with her coffee and said to nobody in particular, "People will really do anything, won't they?" Which was admiring rather than critical. Portland arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, gray and soft, with the particular quality of Pacific Northwest weather, not depressing, just present the sky low and attentive. Their new apartment was in the Selwood neighborhood, twice the square footage of Ravenport, with actual trees visible from every window, and a building that had been retrofitted with the kind of accessibility features that made Sandra nod approvingly when she walked through it. Thomas ran through his room twice before making any decisions about it. Linda stood in the accessible bathroom and said finally, with a specificity that suggested she'd been waiting for grab bars at a useful height for longer than she'd mentioned. Jason stood at the living room window looking out at the wet Portland street below and breathed, just breathed. The air came in and went out without the particular compressed quality it had carried in Ravenport since Linda's diagnosis. Since the bills, since the years of running a schedule tight enough that any deviation required a cascade of adjustments. He was aware this was partly the newness that Portland had its own pressures accumulating just below the visible surface. But for this moment, standing at this window, he let himself feel the space. Nicole came and stood beside him. She didn't say anything, just looked out at the same wet street, her shoulder against his. He reached over and took her hand. The Cascadia Innocence Project occupied the third floor of a building on S.W. Morrison Street in downtown Portland, and Jason arrived on his first day in a jacket that was appropriate for a professional setting without being the kind of suit that would make him look like he'd wandered in from somewhere else. Eric King met him at the door, 50s compact with the particular economy of movement of someone who doesn't waste energy on anything non-essential, including reassurance. "We lose more cases than we win," Eric said, walking Jason through the office, which had the controlled disorder of a place where serious work happened and space was not wasted on aesthetics. "The cases we take are hard by definition. If they were easy, someone else would have fixed them already. You're going to spend months on files that don't move. You're going to build arguments that fall apart. You're going to meet clients who've been inside for years for things they didn't do. And most days you will not be able to tell them when it ends." He stopped at the door of a small office with a window overlooking the street and a desk covered in stacked folders. "Can you work in those conditions?" Jason thought about the bar at 2 in the morning, about evidence outlines written in the margins of order pads, about the particular discipline of a life that had given him no alternative to patience. "I've been losing more than I win my whole life," he said. At least here I'm losing for something that actually matters. Eric studied him for a moment with the evaluating attention of someone who has interviewed enough people to know the difference between the prepared answer and the true one. Then he nodded and went back to his own office, and Jason Robinson sat down at the desk covered in files and went to work. The work was brutal in the way that meaningful things are brutal not gratuitously, but because the stakes were actual and the obstacles were real, and the margin for error was a person's continued imprisonment. He came home most evenings with his mind still running on whatever he'd left on the desk, the details of a case following him through dinner and bath time and bedtime, requiring conscious effort to set down far enough to be present for Thomas and Linda, and the particular domestic texture of the apartment's evenings. Nicole had dinner ready most nights. This had happened by accumulation rather than arrangement. She was home. She cooked. The cooking improved week over week as she applied to recipes the same systematic attention she'd applied to everything else in her life. Thomas was an honest critic in the way that children are, which meant the failures were clearly identified and the improvements were specifically praised, which Nicole found more useful than the polite ambiguity most adults offered. Sandra ate with them 2 nights a week and brought food from a Jamaican place on Division Street that she'd discovered in her first week and considered Portland's primary redeeming quality. Linda's first appointment with Dr. Brian Thompson happened 10 days after arrival. He was younger than Dr. Lee, more informal, with the slightly rumpled quality of someone whose attention was almost entirely on the work rather than the presentation of the work. He reviewed Linda's file with visible interest, asked her several questions, whose precision indicated he'd read the file thoroughly before the appointment, and delivered his assessment without softening it toward or away from good news. The protocol Dr. Lee had you on is solid. Your numbers are better than I'd expect for this stage of treatment. We'll continue what was working and monitor closely for any variance. He looked at her over the file. You're more robust than your chart suggested. Linda looked back at him with the particular expression she reserved for people who underestimated her. I'm aware. Rachel Flores arrived in Portland in late July, 2 weeks before her wedding in Seattle. She and her fiancé, Marcus, had split the distance, her family on the West Coast and his in Portland, the wedding itself in the geographic middle. She appeared at the apartment on a Saturday afternoon with a bottle of wine and the assessing energy of someone who has been curious about a person for months and is finally in the same room with them. She looked at Jason the way people look at something they've been hearing about at length from a source they trust. So you're the bartender who cost me $10,000. Jason looked at her with the equivalent curiosity. And you're the one who thought Nicole was too cold to fall in love. A beat. Then Rachel laughed, a real one, surprised and loud. I like him, she said to Nicole in the tone of someone delivering a verdict that had not been entirely certain. He's got spine. They had dinner at the apartment, Nicole's current best pasta dish, which had reached a level of reliable competence that Thomas had recently upgraded from good enough to actually good, which Sandra noted was high praise. Rachel sat next to Thomas, and they discussed with apparent mutual interest the question of whether dromaeosaurids were more dangerous than popular media suggested. Rachel's position, uninformed but instinctively correct, was yes. Thomas spent 12 minutes explaining why. After dinner, when Linda and Sandra had retreated to the living room and Thomas was doing his reading, Rachel sat with Jason and Nicole at the kitchen table over the last of the wine. She looked at Jason directly. She called me the night after she met you. She didn't say much, just that she'd met someone, and the bet was complicated. A pause. I've known Nicole since we were 22. I've never heard her use the word complicated about a person before. She calculates people. She doesn't find them complicated. What did you tell her? Jason asked. I told her complicated was better than simple, because simple was what she'd been doing, and it wasn't working. Rachel turned her glass. She told me about the bet, about when it stopped being a bet. When was that from her side? Rachel looked at Nicole, who was watching this with the composure of someone who has decided to let the conversation happen without managing it. The night she called me and forgot to mention the bet entirely. We talked for an hour about your son's dinosaur theories. Nicole said nothing. The small, unguarded look on her face was its own answer. Later that evening, after Rachel had gone back to her hotel and Thomas was asleep, Nicole received a call from her COO. A property deal in Chicago had hit a zoning complication that required a decision with real financial consequence, and the decision had to be made tonight. She took the call in the bedroom and was on the phone for 2.5 hours. Jason stayed in the kitchen. He could hear her through the wall, not the words, but the register and rhythm of her voice, which shifted entirely into the mode he'd first encountered in the Iron Anchor, precise and controlled and several steps ahead of whoever she was talking to. When she came out, she looked tired and sharp and entirely focused the way a knife looks when it has been used for what it was made for. She sat down across from him at the kitchen table. He pushed a glass of water toward her. "You miss it," he said. "Not an accusation, an observation offered the way you offer something true that you think a person needs to hear." Nicole wrapped her hands around the glass. She looked past him at the window at the Portland night beyond it, and was quiet long enough to give the question the consideration it deserved. "Parts of it," she said finally, "the problem solving. The moment when a complicated deal resolves and you can see the whole structure of it clicking into place." She looked back at him, but not the rest, not the loneliness at the center of it, not the way everything eventually came back to the same empty room. She set the glass down. "I want this. I want Portland and Thomas's dinner commentary, and Sandra's cooking, and your mother winning arguments with her doctors. I want the life that's actually happening." A pause, something certain settling into her voice. "This is the first real thing I've ever had, and I'm not trading real for anything." He reached across the table and took her hand. She turned her palm up and held on. Linda mentioned the marriage thing on a Tuesday afternoon in August, sitting in the waiting room of Portland General, while Dr. Thompson ran her quarterly labs. She said it the way she said most important things, sideways, as if she were talking about something adjacent. "That woman has been ready to commit to you since approximately month 3. She's been patient about it because she understood your pace. But Jason, your pace is becoming an excuse." He looked at his mother over his coffee cup. "We've never talked about—" "She has. To me, twice." Linda's expression was not unkind. "She's not waiting for you to be certain. She's waiting for you to stop being afraid that certainty is something you're not allowed to feel." He sat with that through the rest of the appointment and on the drive home and through dinner and through Thomas's bedtime, which involved an extended discussion of whether articulated skeletons in museums were more educational than casts and required Jason's full engagement to resolve. He lay awake that night next to Nicole, who slept with the deep ease of someone who has made her decisions and stands behind them, and thought about what his mother had said. He thought about a lot of things, about the wall he'd built and the reasons he'd built it and whether the reasons still applied, about Thomas asking if Nicole would stay, about the particular steadiness of someone who has been exactly where she said she'd be every single time. He thought about the ring he'd bought 3 weeks ago and put in his sock drawer because he'd been waiting for the right moment, by which he meant he'd been waiting for a version of certainty that he was starting to understand might be another name for the fear of being certain. He started planning. Dinner at a good restaurant, the Italian place on NW 23rd, that Nicole had mentioned once and then mentioned again, which meant she'd noticed it. A Saturday in September. Thomas with Sandra for the evening, the city cooperative. He planned it carefully over 2 weeks. He never used the plan. It was a Tuesday in September, completely ordinary, the kind of evening that announces nothing. Thomas was asleep. Sandra had gone home. Linda was in her room with a book. Jason and Nicole were doing the dishes in the kitchen, a division of labor that had established itself organically, him washing her, drying a rhythm so practiced it required no coordination. The window over the sink showed the backyard of the building next door, a maple tree beginning its fall color. The sky, the particular blue of a Pacific Northwest September evening. Nicole was telling him about a call with her COO, something about a potential acquisition in Hartford, that the board was divided on the particulars, requiring enough context that she was laying them out methodically, which meant she was talking in the precise, organized way she used when she was thinking while speaking. He was listening and washing a pasta bowl, and she said something that struck him as unexpectedly funny. A detail about a board member who had objected to the acquisition on grounds so thin they were transparent, stated with the solemn gravity of someone delivering serious analysis, and he laughed. Not a polite laugh. A real one, sudden and full, the kind that startles you. He set the bowl down, looked at her. She was looking back at him with the expression she got when he laughed, unexpectedly pleased, slightly curious, as if she were still surprised, months into this, that she'd caused it. "Marry me," he said. The words came out before the plan could stop them, which was probably right. Nicole went still. The dish towel in her hand stopped moving. She looked at him with the careful attention of someone making sure they've heard correctly. What? Marry me. Not because it's the next logical step, or because we've been together long enough, or because it makes practical sense. He turned to face her, fully water still on his hands. Because I love you. Because you walked into my bar on a bad night and saw something worth seeing. Because you moved across the country for work that mattered to me before it mattered to my career. Because you're honest with Thomas even when it would be easier not to be. And you sit with my mother in waiting rooms without being asked, and you do dishes with me on Tuesday nights. And that turns out to be everything. He held her gaze. I want to spend the rest of my life being grateful for the night you walked in out of the rain. Nicole hadn't moved. You don't have a ring. I have a ring. It's in my sock drawer. I had a whole planned restaurant September, the right moment. He shook his head. This is the right moment. This is exactly the right moment. You proposed to me doing dishes. I proposed to you being completely myself, which is what I am when I'm doing dishes with you on a Tuesday. Nicole looked at him for a long moment, long enough that the kitchen held only the sound of the tap still running slightly and the tree outside moving in the evening wind. Then she set the dish towel down on the counter and closed the distance between them and kissed him with the particular quality of something that has been decided completely, no reservation anywhere in it. He put his wet hands on her face anyway. She didn't care. When they pulled apart, she was crying, which she'd done approximately twice in his presence over the course of everything they'd been through together. And both times it had carried the specific weight of something she couldn't or wouldn't perform, genuine and therefore significant. Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. It was always yes. He got the ring from the sock drawer. It fit. He had not been entirely certain it would, having estimated from memory rather than asking, but it did, which felt like the kind of luck that you earn rather than receive. Thomas found out at breakfast the following morning and immediately began planning his role in the proceedings, which included but was not limited to ring bearer status. The provision of dinosaur-themed decorations and a recommendation that Linda walk Nicole down the aisle since Nicole didn't have a father, and Linda was basically her family anyway. Nicole looked at Jason over Thomas's head. He lifted his shoulders slightly. Your call, and she looked at Thomas and said, I was going to ask her myself, actually, but I'm glad you mentioned it. Thomas nodded with satisfaction. I figured. I just wanted to make sure you'd thought of it. Linda cried when they told her. Not the quiet kind. The full version, uncontained, which she made no effort to manage. When she'd composed herself enough to speak, she looked at Jason and said, I've been waiting for this since the second Sunday she came to the laundromat. She looked at Nicole. Welcome to the family, sweetheart. You've been in it for a while already. This is just the paperwork. They were married on the second Saturday of October in Selwood Park, which had mature trees and a section of open lawn, large enough for the small gathering they'd invited. The day arrived with the specific generosity of Portland autumn, clear cold, the maples at full color, the light at the particular angle that makes everything look considered. Sandra had found a caterer through someone at Dr. Thompson's office. Rachel flew down from Seattle and brought Marcus, her new husband, who got along with Thomas immediately on the grounds of a shared position on the relative merits of Pacific Northwest hiking trails. Thomas performed his ring-bearer duties with complete seriousness. The Triceratops pin on his lapel, the only indication that the formal suit contained the same child who had the previous Tuesday staged a reenactment of the KPG extinction event using the living room couch as the Yucatan Peninsula. He walked down the aisle with the focused gravity of someone who understands the weight of the occasion and intends to honor it. Linda walked Nicole down the aisle in the wheelchair, which had been decorated the previous evening with small white flowers by Thomas and Sandra, in a project that had taken 90 minutes and produced results that everyone agreed were excellent. Linda held Nicole's hand on the armrest the whole length of the grass, and Nicole held Linda's hand back, and by the time they reached the spot where Jason was standing, both of them had the specific composure of people who are managing something large and choosing not to let it overwhelm the moment. Jason looked at Nicole coming toward him across the autumn grass and thought about a Thursday night in a rain-hammered bar and the particular kind of luck that looks from the outside like coincidence and feels from the inside like everything you were moving toward finally arriving. She was wearing something simple and exactly right. And she was looking at him the way she'd looked at him across the table at Maggie's diner on their first morning, like he was real, and real was what she'd been looking for. The vows were the ones they'd written themselves, which had required 3 attempts each and a combined total of approximately 4 hours of revision, and were better for it. Jason promised to let her help carry the weight to stop treating his own need for support as a failure of character. Nicole promised to stay when things were hard, which she noted was a promise she'd already been keeping and intended to formalize. Thomas, at Jason's request, said his piece. He promised to try to stop leaving things in her shoes, specifying that he understood. This was a recurring problem and that he was committed to improvement, if not perfection. The laugh from the gathered people was the best kind, genuine, warm, dissolving, the formality that ceremonies tend to accumulate. Rachel's toast referenced the bet with the precision of someone who has thought carefully about how to acknowledge a complicated origin without letting it define what came after. I made the bet because I was worried about her, Rachel said, looking at Nicole with the directness of real friendship. I thought if I pushed her into actually trying, she might remember that she wanted things. I didn't know what she'd find. I didn't know that what she'd find would be someone worth keeping. She raised her glass. I'm glad I was wrong about her, and I'm glad you were right about her, Jason. You knew something I didn't, that there was a real person in there who just needed someone patient enough to wait for her to show up. Nicole looked at Jason across the small gathering, and he saw in her face the full accumulation of everything that had passed between them, the bar and the diner, and the laundromat, and the hospital corridor, and the roof and the parking lot at Ravenport General, and the Tuesday dishes, and the Portland kitchen, and he thought, this is what it means to have built something that was worth building. That evening, after Thomas was staying overnight with Sandra, after Linda had been helped to bed with the particular exhaustion that followed any extended good occasion, Jason and Nicole sat on the apartment's small back porch in the October cold with the last of the wine. The maple in the yard next door had lost about a third of its leaves. The Portland night was quiet in the way cities are quiet when they have set down the day's business and haven't yet picked up the next one. Did you ever think it would end up here? Nicole asked. That first night, when I sat down at your bar, I thought you were going to finish one drink and leave, and I was never going to think about it again. He looked at the yard. I was wrong about that within about 10 minutes. I thought you were going to be a game I won. She turned her glass slowly. I was wrong about that in about the same amount of time. What changed it specifically? She thought about it. You gave me water without explaining why. Nobody does that. Nobody looks at a person they've never met and thinks she needs something she didn't ask for. You did it without making it a thing. She leaned her head against his shoulder. I kept trying to find the angle in that, and there wasn't one. You just saw something and responded to it. Most people don't do that. He thought about what it had cost her to trust that, given what she'd been working with. Given a father who'd been present and absent simultaneously, a business world that had confirmed every suspicion she'd arrived with, years of optimizing for efficiency in a life that had hollowed itself out in the process. He thought about the particular kind of courage it took to walk back into the Iron Anchor on a Monday night after everything she'd thought had been a transaction and sit down and keep going. You could have stopped coming back, he said. Yes. After the first night when you went back to whatever you were doing, you could have decided the thing you felt was just novelty and let it go. Yes. A pause. I called Rachel that night. She asked how the bet was going. I forgot to answer the question. She tilted her head to look at him. That's when I knew. It makes you wonder, how many real things do we walk past every day because they don't arrive packaged the way we expected them? How many times do we mistake complicated for wrong, or unfamiliar for dangerous, or the thing that asks something of us for the thing we can't afford? How many times does the person we were looking for walk into the room and we almost miss them because we're watching the door? We thought they'd come through. Jason Robinson put his arm around his wife on the back porch of their Portland apartment in the October cold and looked at the maple tree dropping its leaves into the dark yard below, and let himself be without qualification where he was. The bar was behind him, somewhere back through 18 months in 1,000 miles. The exam was behind him. The impossible schedule, the 4-hour nights, the arithmetic that never quite resolved, all of it behind him, not erased, but transformed into the specific shape of the man sitting here, which was the man who had put in the work and didn't have to pretend otherwise. Linda was asleep inside with years ahead of her, instead of months. Thomas was across the city learning what it felt like to sleep somewhere new and wake up to the same life. Sandra had driven home through Portland streets with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who has watched a family find its shape and knows her part in it. Rachel was somewhere in a Seattle hotel room texting Nicole approximately every 20 minutes, which Nicole was answering, while also holding Jason's hand. Because she was efficient and also because she could. Have you ever had something walk into your life through the wrong door, at the wrong time in the wrong package, and turned out to be exactly right? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. The wind moved through the maple tree. The city breathed around them. And they stayed where they were because there was nowhere else to be.